Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle. I can't believe we're already halfway through Victober, and I have to say, this has been a fantastic Victober so far. I am reading so many great Victorian books and books set in the Victorian era and non-fiction books about the Victorian era. I mean, it's just been so great. I'm having so much fun. So this is my week 2 wrap up of what I've been reading for Victober. And the first book I want to talk about is Old St. Paul's by William Harrison Ainsworth. I loved this. This was so fun. So once again, I have my notes that I took in my Victorian notebook. I love this notebook. Okay, so Old St. Paul's was written in 1841, and it is set in 1665, 1666, and it kind of covers the events of the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London that happened in 1666. There were great characters in this book that I really liked. We follow Mr. Blondell, Stephen Blondell. He is a grocer who lives in the city of London. His wife, his son, and he's got sons and daughters, but his older daughter, Amabel, and his apprentice, Leonard Holt. And Leonard is a great character. I really, really liked Leonard. That was great. We also follow a character called Solomon Eagle. He is a Quaker, and he spends the majority of his time in the book denouncing doom on the city. And he is often referred to as the enthusiast in the book. We also have the Earl of Rochester and his continual attempts to carry off Amabel. Now, the Earl of Rochester is well known as a friend of the King, Charles II, and a rake and a man who cannot be trusted with women. He has all of these schemes and disguises, and it's hilarious actually because it's very Shakespearean in that he will have a disguise, probably very minimal. It's never really given in great detail, his disguises, but the fact that people don't recognize him is what's so very Shakespearean about it. Is he'll put on this disguise and then suddenly nobody knows who he is. You know, he is the watchman he says he is, or whoever. We also have Nisa Macascree. Her dad is the blind piper. And we have Sir Paul Paravisin, who is a comrade, a friend of the Earl of Rochester. And a couple of the villains of the story, we have Judith, who is a plague nurse, and she is ruthless and plundering, unscrupulous. And then we have Chowles, who is the coffin maker, and he is the same, ruthless, plundering, unscrupulous. Both of them are loving the fact that the plague is decimating the city because they are profiting off of it. We have Dr. Hodges, who is a great doctor, one of the ones who did not flee the city, and who is helping to the best of his ability, whoever he can help. And then we also have Blaze, who is Blondell's porter, and he is hilarious because he's that character during a crisis like the plague who takes all of the quack remedies. Anything he hears of, he takes it, and he takes them all together, not realizing that when you take so many different things, they might counteract with each other or how they'll behave in your system. But he's hilarious. He will do absolutely anything he hears about as a remedy for the plague. And so that one was actually quite amusing. I want to read to you a quote from close to the beginning of the book. This is from pages 2 and 3. The consternation now began. The whole city was panic-stricken. Nothing was talked of but the plague, nothing planned but means of arresting its progress. One grim and ghastly idea possessed the minds of all. like a hideous phantom stalking the streets at noonday, scarring all in its path, Death took his course through London and selected his prey at pleasure. Isn't that great? And then here's another great quote, and this is the day after the Earl of Rochester first meets Amabel. Now, we find out that he had heard of her and her beauty, but the day after, the very first time he met her, this is what he says. "Do not fly me, Amabel," he cried in an impassioned tone, "but suffer me to declare the love I have for you. I cannot live without you." Awesome. Okay. And so, yeah, so it's just such a great story of how these people behave during the plague, how they survive or not survive. Mr. Blondel, the grocer, he decides that he is going to basically board up his house with his family inside and wait it out. So he brings in all kinds of supplies, ensures that he has a fresh water supply, and then he just, his family, they never leave the house for like 6 months. It's really interesting. There's also the unrequited love. So we have Leonard, who is in love with Amabel, and then Nisa, who is in love with Leonard. So that's great. There's elements of the sensation novel in this. I wouldn't say that this is itself a sensation novel, although maybe it is, but there's elements, there's definitely secrets in here. Most importantly connected to Nisa, which are really interesting. There's also a ton of coincidences, which are, I think that's classic of maybe Victorian novels in general, but potentially also in sensation novels. And then here's one more quote from towards the end of the book, referencing the fire. And those scenes were incredible, describing the fire and how it spread and people's reactions to it. Vociferations, oaths, shrieks, and outcries of every description stunned the ear. Night was turned into day. The awful roaring of the flames was ever and anon broken by the thundering fall of some heavy roof. Flakes of fire were scattered far and wide by the driving wind, carrying destruction wherever they alighted and spreading the conflagration on all sides, till it seemed like a vast wedge of fire driven into the heart of the city. And thus it went on, swallowing up all before it like an insatiate monster and roaring for very joy. Isn't that great? So yeah, I loved this. I'm so glad that I read it. There was also some really interesting information in the introduction that I'm going to share with you now. No spoilers, I swear, but there's just some really interesting stuff here. So, in the introduction, Old St. Paul's was first published in the columns of the Sunday Times and is said to be the earliest example of piecemeal appearance of a romance in an English newspaper. For the rights of offering it to their readers, the proprietors paid £1,000, a large sum, but it was at a time when the author's popularity equaled, if did not exceed, that of Charles Dickens. The tale ran through the numbers for 1841 and was then republished in 3 volumes with 20 illustrations by John Franklin, to which in later editions 2 etchings by Phiz were added. It has often been reprinted and is one of the best as well as the most popular of the author's many writings. So I thought that was really interesting. I also looked it up to see what the conversion was to that £1,000 that he was paid in 1841 would have been £106,000 today. And I just thought that was crazy. Okay, here's some more interesting information. Ainsworth has made the great city, stricken first by pestilence and then by fire, the gloomy background of a romantic love story. In addition to the narrative of the fortunes of his hero and heroines, his villains and clowns, Ainsworth has succeeded in painting a vivid and satisfying picture of the life of the English capital at that time of its heaviest disasters. The fullest account we have of the pestilence of 1665 is the Journal of the Plague Year by a citizen, first published in 1722 and now regarded as the work of Daniel Defoe. So it's obvious from the book that Ainsworth had read that, and he used some of the material from there, some of the information, some of the people in his story. Ainsworth, in his historical romances, was always careful to have a foundation of fact, though he did not profess to treat his data as anything more than material for artistic effect. All right, and then one more. Ainsworth has not allowed his historical data to overwhelm him, but whilst the story moves briskly forward, we see the old city with its narrow lanes, its picturesque houses, its noble churches, its broad waterway, suddenly brought to desolation, the grass growing in the streets, the dead lying in the roadway where they have fallen. We hear the bell of the dead cart carrying its ghastly burden to the plague pit. We hear, too, the horror and blasphemous merriment of the roisterers who carouse until the pestilence strikes them dead. We see thieves plundering. We see murderers dispatch those whom the plague might spare. We see, and amidst all these horrors, we see, moving among the dead and dying, the strange figure of Solomon Eagle, and hear him screaming out his denunciations of woe against the modern Nineveh. From pulpits here and there flow soberer words of warning and consolation. And through the gloomy streets and into the stricken households pass the good physicians intent on their errands of mercy. And when the angel of the pestilence, after bringing death into thousands of homes, has passed away, we see another messenger of wrath. We see the great fire scorching and destroying the beauty and grandeur of the ancient city. So and that's a great description. That's what this story is, and you see it through the eyes of just a few people. Plus you also get this great other story that's happening in the midst of this crisis. I just really enjoyed it. I wanted to give you this description of Solomon Eagle because he was such a fascinating character. As Leonard drew near, he found the assemblage was listening to the exhortations of an enthusiast, whom he instantly recognized from a description he had heard of him from Blaise. The name of this half-crazed being was Solomon Eagle. Originally a Quaker, upon the outbreak of the plague, he had abandoned his home and friends and roamed the streets at night, denouncing doom to the city. He was a tall, gaunt man with long, jet-black hair hanging in disordered masses over his shoulders. His eyes were large and black and blazed with insane luster, and his looks were so wild and terrific that it required no great stretch of imagination to convert him into the genius of the pestilence. Entirely stripped of apparel, except that his loins were girt with a sheepskin in imitation of St. John in the wilderness, he bore upon his head a brazier of flaming coals, the lurid light of which, falling upon his sable locks and tawny skin, gave him an unearthly appearance. So Old St. Paul's, if you can get a hold of a copy of this, I highly recommend it. All right, and then I also read The House at Baker Street by Michelle Burkeby. This is a book that was written in 2016, I believe, yes, but is set in the Victorian era in London. Behind every great detective stands a great woman. And this is the story of Mrs. Hudson and Mary Watson. And I really enjoyed this. This was really fun. We did get a bit of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, Dr. Watson, but really the focus was on Mrs. Hudson and the housekeeper, and Mary Watson, Dr. Watson's wife. So yeah, this was so good. And so we are told, the story is narrated in the first person from the perspective of Mrs. Hudson. And it's great. We really get into her mind, and we find that she loves being in her kitchen. That's her domain. She says that often. But there's a vent that she keeps open because it connects to Sherlock's study or living room or whatever you want to call it. And so she listens to his consultations, and she sees a woman had come in, was very upset, and wouldn't give Sherlock the information he needed, so he sent her on her way. And Mary and Mrs. Hudson, Martha, you know, when she's coming down the stairs and she's upset, they ask her to come into the kitchen, they offer her some tea, and they listen to her story. And her story is that she is being blackmailed by someone. And so Mrs. Hudson and Mary Watson decide to get involved. And it was just great. I really liked their characters, how they're portrayed in this book. We also see a little bit of Irene Adler, the woman. So yeah, this was just really fun. I quite enjoyed this. And then I've also been continuing with The Invention of Murder by Judith Flanders, how the Victorians reveled in death and detection and created modern crime. It's been really interesting. She's talked about, so far in the couple chapters that I've read, one chapter was like 86 pages long, so it was a really long chapter, which is why I'm only so far into the book. But she talks about real cases, and then she talks about how those were handled by the newspapers, which was really interesting because in the very, very early Victorian era, and even some of the cases she talks about at the beginning were kind of before the Victorian era, but the newspapers just told everything, and this was before even a trial took place. They just revealed everything and also just gave their opinions. So that was interesting. She also talks about how these murderers and murder cases were fodder for penny dreadfuls, or penny bloods as they were called, short publications of that kind of became highly fictionalized of these cases. Theaters, plays, even puppet shows, marionettes, would use this material for their shows. It was really, really interesting. I marked a couple pages here. So she's talking here about penny dreadfuls, penny bloods. The Bloods, penny bloods, astonishing success created a vast new readership for cheap fiction. Between 1830 and 1850, there were probably as many as 100 publishers of penny fiction, 10 for every one publisher of respectable fiction. Many magazines, previously seen as improving reading for the working classes, now wholeheartedly gave themselves over to this type of tale. The first ever penny blood in 1836 was the lives of the most notorious highwaymen, footpads, etc. in 60 numbers. Gentleman Jack followed, running for 205 parts over 4 years, without too much worry for historical accuracy or continuity. And then one more. Oh yeah, because I didn't know this, but she's talking about theaters using these stories for their shows, for plays. And The Woman in White, I didn't know they turned that into a play. The Woman in White, the staging of Wilkie Collins' 1859 to 60 novel, had produced Woman in White bonnets and Woman in White perfume. So they were talking about how these plays were really popular, and then out of them came other things that people could buy. And in this case, bonnets and perfume connected to that story. So yeah, that's really fun. So that's my week 2 of Victober. Have you read any of these books? Have you read anything by William Harrison Ainsworth? I feel like he's a Victorian author that just is never ever talked about. So if you're familiar with him or read any of his works, let's chat about that in the comment section down below. And I will see you for another video soon.